Oh, hello to everyone. Welcome. Good evening. Very late for some of our colleagues on the continent. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. Thank you very much to those of you here in the room. It's really an honor to be here to welcome our colleagues from the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue who have been really engaging with a situation that's very critical for our continent, but really for the globe as we begin to think of realities of war, of conflict, of instability, but also realities of peace. And, we're going to go through the range of all of those realities in the conversation today. It's been wonderful to bring to you those who are really taking part in a lot of these activities, who are convening spaces, who are convening colleagues, who are especially convening those that are affected and making sure that those voices remain at the center of finding resolution, finding an end to this conflict, but perhaps more critically than finding an end to the conflict, thinking through pathways for peace associated with that. So of course, today we're speaking especially about Sudan, which remains very critical for many of us that work on these issues, but especially for many of us that are from that very dear continent, from the African continent, and for many also that may not be from the continent, but are very committed, are very invested in the African continent and recognize our shared humanity and the significance of taking very seriously what is going on in that spaces and the impact it has on all of us, wherever we are located on this globe. So we're going to talk about Sudan. We're, of course, going to talk about that in an interconnected way, reflecting on the wider Horn of Africa. We know that the situation there, but situation in many parts of our continent are often transnational, and this is certainly a case where that's the reality. So we look forward to a very enriching set of conversations, reflections, knowledge, wisdom that we'll also receive. We also very much look forward to engagement from those of you that are here with us in the room, those of us that are here in the virtual room as well. Thank you for joining us. Thank you so much. We know that there are many things to be doing today, and we don't take it for granted that you have graced us with your presence. So my name is Eka Ife. I am the director of the African Leadership Center here at King's College London. I will hand over to my executive director, Shuvai Nyoni, who is the executive director of the African Leadership Center. She's based at the African Leadership Center in Nairobi. We have the privilege of being a unit that is global, that is co-located here in London at King's College London, and in Nairobi as a joint initiative between the University of Nairobi and King's College London, but stands as an educational trust that is independent as well. And Shuvai Nyoni, our executive director, will guide proceedings along with Dr. Tunde Afolabi. But I'll hand over now to Shuvai to take us through the evening and connect us to Dr. Afolabi as well. Thank you very much and welcome to you.
Thank you so much, Eka. And good evening to all of you. I'm just going to stand for now so that I can get my voice projecting. And once it's set, I think I'll be able to sit down and speak to you from sitting down. But a very warm welcome to you all. Thank you so much for joining us this evening for this discussion on conflict in Sudan and the wider Horn of Africa. As Eka has said, and as we will hear from Tunde in a little bit, as well as our panelists, this is one of the most egregious conflicts of our generation and of our time, and one that we don't see or hear about every day unless we're looking for the information. And this is one of the things that I hope we will touch on as we go through this evening. My job right now is to just talk a little bit about how our evening will proceed. It is a conversation, and as Eka has said, it's a conversation with people who are working daily on the issues. Some of the people we will hear from are in the room, and we have others who are online. We have with us today Ambassador Haile Menkarios. I will not go into too much of a description. Tunde will also do that. But he is a seasoned diplomat, researcher, academic, scholar, practitioner, and with deep experiential knowledge of the region that we will be talking about today. We have Ms. Asma Ahmed, who also is at the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue. She will be with us online. She was not able to join us, partly because of a topic that we will be discussing at the ALC in a couple of weeks on visas and European visas and denials and things like that, for Africans especially. So please do join us for that conversation. Sorry, just to give a plug, Eka, for a forthcoming conversation. We also have with us Ms. Ganao Mulugeta, who's also from the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue. Ms. Ganao is here with us in the room. And we have Mr. Donald Daya, who is the Chief Executive Officer of the Pan-African Lawyers Union, and he is going to be joining us also online from Arusha. And so we look forward to hearing from all of these wonderful panelists this evening. Once I hand over to Tunde, he will take us through, we will divide the evening up into 2 segments. We will hear in the first part from Ambassador Menkarios and Asma, specifically on Sudan and of course interrelated issues. We will have a little bit of interaction after that and come back to then hear from Donald and from Ms. Ganao on the broader, more Pan-African components, but also the connections to the broader region and other countries, Ethiopia, South Sudan, Somalia, Somaliland, Eritrea, that are linked to what is happening in Sudan at the moment, and to give us a better sense of the dynamics in the region. We will then have another interaction and come back to, once again, to our panelists, but also give another opportunity to the room, both the physical room and the virtual room. We might have Ambassador Ibn Chambers joining us a little bit later. He's a special envoy of the African Union on Sudan, but also leading a high-level panel on Sudan for the African Union. And if he's able to join us, we might have some inputs from him a little bit later on. So that is how our evening will work. Again, welcome, Karibuni Sana, and I'm going to hand over to Tunde to take us through, but I'll just tell you a little bit about Tunde before he speaks to us. Babatunde Afolabi is the Africa Regional Director at the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue, and this is a Geneva-based private diplomacy organization where he has overseen and been involved in peace mediation and political dialogue processes across Africa. Prior to joining HD, Tunde had worked as the head of section, political affairs at the Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS Commission, and also worked at the Center for Democracy and Development and at the African Leadership Forum. I won't read the rest of his bio, but safe to say Tunde is a friend and brother of the African Leadership Center. In fact, this afternoon or this morning, I was interacting with our fellows, and I think they had quite a lively conversation. But Tunde, you're very welcome, and I hand over to you now.
Thank you very much. And while standing on existing protocols, allow me to sit. I don't think I need to stand to project. I'm from Nigeria. And, we are known to have...
How we are bullied in the rest of the country. Okay.
I mean, it's a reality that we have very loud voices and many other attributes. But a pleasure to be here today, and wonderful for the ALC King's College to be hosting us. Of course, special thanks to Professor Eka Ikpe. We go way back, as well as, of course, Shubai and other senior colleagues that I can see across the room. Professor Alao Randolph, it's been so long, but it's good to see you, Dr. Ishmael, and the rest of the team. Good to be here. And of course, I have the task of reading Haile's very long, elaborate, and impressive CV, and I'll try to be as concise as possible while doing that. But before doing that, I wanted to just again underscore the importance of today's discussion, the timeliness of it, because of the devastation that has occurred in Sudan since the 15th of April last year. It's about 17-18 months now since this unfortunate conflict erupted between 2 arms of the Sudanese armed forces. 2 main, groups of wings of the armed forces. It has been quite devastating. I dare say that this has actually been the most devastating conflict in a long time. It doesn't get as much traction as Gaza or Ukraine or the recent conflict in Lebanon, but it has been very devastating, and you can only better understand how terrible this has been for the people of Sudan as well as there are 7 contiguous neighbors by looking at the figures. Over 3 million, refugees across the region. Places like Uganda, Egypt, Chad, as well as South Sudan. Over 11 million people have been displaced from their homes, and several other, benchmarks, for catastrophe, unfortunately. It has also defied, every concerted effort by mediators to engage and to resolve the conflict, unfortunately. And perhaps this is why tonight it becomes important to actually look at the various approaches, the various interventions that have been initiated, whether with the UN, with the African Union, IGAD, etc., as well as the US and Saudi Arabia, and to see whether there is going to be momentum for a new way of looking at the conflict, and hopefully a new way of being able to resolve it, particularly in the light of 2 major, if you like, soon-to-be events. First being the impending change of guard in Washington in January or February. Hopefully, people say that change of baton may not necessarily lead to anything, because Africa is Africa, right? It probably doesn't feature as highly as it should be. But then, beyond the altruistic reasons why you should engage that conflict, there is also the geostrategic importance of Sudan. About 14% at least of global sea freight goes through the Red Sea. So insecurity in those parts certainly impacts negatively on business, if you like. And of course, it's also not by accident that you have the powers, the established as well as the emergent medium powers, trying to situate bases, etc., across that part of the world. So beyond the altruistic, maybe there are reasons why people should take Sudan, the conflict, more seriously. So that is that in terms of what may happen in Washington going forward. Secondly, is also looking inwardly in Africa. You have by February an impending change. There would be a new chairperson for the African Union. Would there be a new momentum as well? It is something that we should perhaps deliberate on a little bit and then see whether change can happen. So having said that, I would like to very quickly, it's a very rich, very long CV for Haile. I would like to just touch on the key highlights. Ambassador Haile Menkorios, fondly referred to within HD as Haile, is a senior advisor at the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue, supporting peacemaking efforts in the Horn of Africa countries in general and in the Sudan in particular. Prior to joining HD, Haile had a remarkable career in the United Nations, where he held several high-level positions. From 2011 to 2013, he served as Special Envoy of the UN Secretary General for Sudan and South Sudan, followed by his tenure as the head of the UN mission in Sudan from 2009 to 2011. He also held the position of UN Assistant Secretary General for Political Affairs from 2007 to 2009, and served in various senior roles within UN headquarters and field missions from 2002 to 2007. Haile is a seasoned diplomat who served as Eritrean permanent representative to the UN from 1997 to 2000, prior to joining the UN. He was Special Envoy to Somalia and the Great Lakes region, an ambassador of Eritrea to Ethiopia and the African Union. Haile holds a BA degree from Brandeis University and an MA from Harvard University, where he was teaching fellow before joining the Eritrean liberation struggle. Very impressive, Haile. Before I forget, we also have, of course, a co-panelist, Asma Ahmed, our colleague who is unable to join in person. But Asma, I hope you can hear us. It's good to have you here. Yes, thank you. Of course, Asma is HD country manager at she's HD country manager on Sudan. Prior to joining HD, Asma had worked for a number of national and international organizations, including the Open Society Foundation, Sudan Democracy First Group, and the Regional Center for Training and Development of Civil Society at Shah Neil College. Asma's previous work focused on supporting inclusive participation in political peace and political processes in Sudan. Asma, it's good to have you here as well, and we'll be coming to you shortly And of course, as Shuvai had said, we would be the second segment of this talk. We'll be looking at Mesgena as well as Donald and seeking questions, and then we'd also, have the opportunity to quickly do a recital of your profiles also. Before I hand over, Haile, there is something that preoccupies a lot of minds. The Sudanese conflict, as we know it today, didn't just happen. It started from, there is a historical context to it. And I think it becomes important in order to fully understand the conflict, its trajectory, and perhaps to prefer a way forward in dealing with it. It's good to go back a little bit rather than look at the proximate effects or causes of the conflict. So based on that, and perhaps for the wider Horn of Africa, because of the several interlinkages, it will be good to hear from you about what you may consider to be a logic or a method to the madness in the Horn of Africa in terms of political instability. What are the overarching socio-political issues, the historical dimensions that have made the Horn a region in perpetual crisis? Arguably the most volatile region on the continent today, perhaps looking at the Sahel as well. So beyond the proximate causes of instability, what are the deep-rooted issues that we need to understand so that can inform any sort of intervention that we can come up with? Haile is a wonderful speaker, as well as Asma. Part of our duties is to ensure that we keep to time. So we would be doing that for 5 minutes, and then we would go over to Asma. So Haile, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The Horn of Africa. Well, the Horn is not called the Horn for nothing. It is almost going through a perfect storm, all the way from Somalia up to Sudan. Why? I think one of the explanations is the fact that the Horn of Africa, states as we know them now in Africa were created during the colonial period by the colonialists, actually, to the extent that they can control. It was not based on his history. It was not based on ethnicity. In other words, if you try to find a rationale, it is just what suited the colonial powers actually to creating a fiefdom. They rule. Well, if we look at history, what makes a country stable? What makes a people a people? It is not only ethnicity, it's a common experience also. It's a common experience. The longer the experience under a colonial period, colonial government, the more the common experience of the people in that area and a we is created. We versus them. That we is what actually makes stability or instability, as we see it now in different parts of Africa. Now, the Horn of Africa is the region that is least impacted by colonialism. If you remember, colonialism came actually from North Africa, then, went to West Africa where it was closer, for the slave trade, for whatever they came for, and then passed through, the southern part of Africa for trade with China, with India. Now, to come like around to the Horn of Africa was a little bit too far. It was not on their way. And colonial domination in East Africa developed after the opening of the Suez Canal. Once the Suez Canal was opened, then the Red Sea became an important waterway, and that is what the struggle actually for the Horn of Africa, East Africa. In fact, Ethiopia was never colonized, not because they were to clash actually in Ethiopia. The French came from French Somaliland, and the British came from British Somaliland, and then the Italians, also latecomers, came from Eritrea, and on Ethiopia they were to fight if they were to unite the British, as they wanted to unite their empire, Cape to Cairo is what they used to call it, across Africa like that, and the French from West to East Africa. Like that. And they were to clash in Ethiopia, and that's why actually the main reason why they decided, in other words, this should be left. Ethiopia was not colonized. So least impact. When did that happen? Only after 1861, once the Suez Canal was opened, and there was too short a time, too short an experience, actually, for many of those countries to have a common experience. I don't mean that's what creates nations, but the reality was that the longer the colonial period, the colonial administration is there, the more actually people create a bond, and the we is created. I always mention the fact that my father never knew what an Afar person from the coastal area looked like, never met. The first time they met was to work for the Italian government as railway construction workers. They were on the same side, and the Italian was on the other side with his. The we gets created, and this is how stability, a stable national consciousness gets created out of a common experience, and therefore there's less of it in the Horn of Africa, and therefore the process of nation formation, the process of state formation is still in process, and the question of identity becomes critical, actually, in the Horn of Africa. That is what we're going through. You remember from an examination of European history, the 30 Years' War, the 100 Years' War, the 2 world wars, so many wars actually in the process of development of the nation state or the multinational state. Actually, that process is a very ugly process of wars. We're going through that really in the Horn of Africa. Overall, Somalia, you could see, immediately after this independence came, what they wanted was to unite all the Somalis actually that were in different, the northern frontier district in Kenya, what was Italian Somaliland, what was British Somaliland, French Somaliland, that's Djibouti, and also part of Somalia that was controlled by Ethiopia, that's the Ogaden. They wanted to unite all that. And this has happened throughout history. We've seen it in Europe, actually, in how many wars. I think that is what is going on in the Horn of Africa. If you see, more than any other region in the world, 3 new states based on this identity has been created in the Horn of Africa. Eritrea, separated from Ethiopia, became an independent state, separate state. South Sudan, separated from Sudan, became a new state. And Somaliland, for all practical purposes, is a separate entity actually from Somalia. Now, this process, still in the minds of some people, is continuing. There's Abiy, for example, who doesn't recognize the Ethiopian state as it has been formed and says, we can't remain without a port, without direct access to the sea, and wants to invade Somalia, Somaliland, wants to invade actually Eritrea, also to take the port of Assab. And you have the Somalis still this irredentism, as they call it, trying to unite Somalia. Sudan was also an empire. And there is no recognition in the center. Whereas in Ethiopia, at least they recognized, when they had different ethnic wars in Ethiopia. And at the end, they recognized, okay, Ethiopia is an empire. How do you democratize an empire? Either it democratizes or it disintegrates. This is what we've seen throughout history. So the Ethiopians chose actually to go towards democratization. They understood that Ethiopia was a multi-ethnic, multi-religious, multicultural state, and the kind of government that must be established must reflect that reality. And that's why they chose a federation. The federation, I think, was the correct setup, but over that federation, instead of having a central government that sort of approximates and gives more, in other words, devolution of powers to the regions, they superimposed on it a highly centralized national government, more or less controlled by one ethnic group. You know the history, what has happened. They're trying to find out still, how do they establish a national government that sort of corresponds to their understanding of a loose federation, ethnic federation. Haven't found actually a way of doing that, but at least the recognition that it is a multi-ethnic, multi-religious, multicultural society is the beginning of establishing a democratic state that unites all of them. In Sudan, they haven't even reached that. There is the riverine, so-called Arabs. They're not any Arab more than we are. It's a mixed really of Arabs and Bejas, but they lost their language. They adopted the Arabic language and therefore call themselves Arabs. And there are the peripheries that were actually incorporated into Sudan, which was the Anglo-Egyptian Sudan at that time, in the 20th century, in fact, the early 1900s. And therefore, you have the riverine Arabs, and you have the other, basically indigenous African societies in South Sudan, in Kordofan, in southern Blue Nile, and in Darfur. Now, there is no recognition yet that Sudan is multi-ethnic, multi-religious, multilingual society. And that indicates to you one of the causes of conflict that has to be resolved. The second is the army. In Sudan, as in Nigeria and India and Pakistan, the British developed the military not only as an instrument of governance in their colonies, in other words, in Sudan, in India, in Pakistan, in Nigeria only, but an instrument of the whole colonial empire that they had, and they fought in many of their wars. So the military was developed as an institution separate than the state, itself. And therefore, since independence, these armies in particular, Nigeria, for example, Nigeria has been ruled by the military throughout. There has been only one leader that was not from the military, either a former military or an existing military. Jonathan, good luck, right. Was the only one. Otherwise, the military as an institution predates independent Nigeria. It predates independent Sudan. And therefore, it was not an instrument of the state. It was actually a body and authority unto itself, with ownership of resources up to 70 to 80%, for example, of the resources in the country, they say. Well, you have then that in power. And within that, I'm passing my limit, I know, but I would say less later on. Within that, Bashir wanted to, that is the former president, wanted what they used to call the coup-proofing the army. So to coup-proof it, what do? You divide it into competing parts that do not have any connection among themselves, but directly report to him as the president. And that is the army, the main army, what is called the SAF, Sudan Armed Forces, the auxiliary forces, which are called the Rapid Deployment Forces, independent, reporting to him directly. And the third was the Sudan security apparatus. The security apparatus was also, a section of the army by itself, with helicopter gunships and tanks and all that, all directly responding to him, so that none of them would unite actually and make another coup, against him. So this is the background actually to the conflict we have, and the war between the RSF and the SAF is just war among two parts of the same army with no ideological difference except who controls the government power in order to control resources in the country. Let me stop there and ask much more knowledge
This is the danger of asking Haile to speak first.
Sorry.
But of course, no. I mean, it's a thing of joy to hear your compelling, historical exposition on Sudan, the Horn, etc. But perhaps highly closer home, more contemporary times, and looking into the future. We had, despite the inherent weaknesses that you have in African institutions, regional institutions such as the African Union, IGAD, etc. There was a time that they at least made concerted efforts to resolve their own conflicts, a few times to prevent them from occurring. Some people like to refer to the halcyon years of 2005, 2015, a bit less, roughly speaking, where you had strong efforts by the regional organizations to try, at least with the help of outsiders, of course, with the UN and the rest of them. That has changed. And unfortunately, with the plethora of conflicts that you have across the continent, there isn't enough political will, perhaps. There aren't enough interventions. And of course, we know what is happening at the multilateral, the UN level as well, with the general challenges that you find with multilateralism. Do you think that with the impending change at the African Union, do you think that also with the way that the global system is evolving, that there will be, excuse me, opportunities, to do things a bit differently for Africa or Africans and the institutions to try at least to make efforts to resolve their own conflicts? What are your views?
Well, we hope so. One hopes so, but then one has to be more realistic as well. Africa is not an isolated continent living alone. Institutional, in other words, cohesion, and to what extent do institutions become sort of an instrument of collective action, is a reflection of how each member state also sees itself actually within that context. I think we had leadership, for example, that was those who fought against colonialism, those who fought against, in other words, oppression in general, coming up with all kinds of ideas, and therefore in the early 1900s, there was a resurgence of we in Africa, we can take care of our, and the leaders, we could name them actually at that time. Second, the global competition. I was at the UN, I could see it, was such that there was an attempt actually to gain the support of Africa. And therefore, whenever the African Union would come with a position, I was there in the political department, and all you have to do is what you want both the West and the East to accept. You first go to the African Union and say, well, the African Union supports it. And they were competing actually to support. Yes, we support. Russians and the Americans leading actually the two camps. It is not like that anymore. It is like that. It's a changed world, really. It's each one to himself. African leaders are aging, actually, if you see them. And therefore, the more they're consumed by internal problems, the less I think. I think it is too much to expect. When they graduate and come to government, we hope. But I don't think it will be a quick change. You might have a better Secretary General or chairman of the commission, for example. But I don't think African leaders as yet want a strong AU. They don't want a strong AU. I am afraid they may not want to make it, to allow him.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Heidi. We'll come back to that, in terms of agency for the AU and the role that African heads of states need to play to ensure that the AU and other institutions are formidable. Asma, thank you. You happen to be Sudanese, working on the Sudan file for HD. And you also have a very rich civil society activist background. It would be good to know your thoughts on what impact, what role that Sudanese civil society can play in the failure, in the absence of efforts from outside. What level of activism, what level of interventions can we realistically expect from within Sudan? Sudan, of course, despite the repressive history, the military, the repression by the military, has a very rich, civil society. Civic action is quite compelling in that country. What are your views, Asma, on this, for the conflict in Sudan?
Thank you, Tundi, and good evening, everyone. It's difficult to follow Haile, but I agree with a lot of his analysis. I think maybe to start on civic actors in general, to just picking up from where Haile left it, is despite the almost 54 years of military rule since the independence of Sudan 68 years ago, despite the push of the dictatorship in terms of the control of the political life, of the cultural life, of the social life, and the repression, I think it's fair to say that we have seen a very resilient civil society and civic movement and activism in Sudan throughout, including during the time of Omar al-Bashir. And I think part of that has been really focused on the history of political parties, the student movement, the civil society, the professional groups, and the resistant groups across the country in different parts. We have seen an armed movement resisting in some of the peripheries, especially in the conflicts that took place in Darfur, in South Sudan, and even in the East as well. We have also seen a lot of organizing in urban areas. And I think the most powerful and changing factors have happened when we have seen alliances of all of these formations, political formations, whether in the 90s when the opposition was there organizing right before the negotiation on the CPA, or when we have seen that after the failure of the so-called the national dialogue after the uprising, the aborted one in 2013, and the organizing of armed groups, civil society, and political parties. And I think the last example of that we have seen in the organizing during the 2018 uprising. And if it wasn't for that alliance that have brought all of these actors borrowing power from this collective action and organizing, I don't think it would have been possible to make that change. I think one of the current dilemmas, and again, when you talk about the context of a war, and with the two main factors that Haile mentioned, that throughout our history, the issue of the control of the military as an institution of the politics has been dominant since independence. And especially during the time of Omar al-Bashir, the last 30 years, so we had the 22 eras of dictatorship, and then we had the 30 years of Omar al-Bashir's rule. And I think that was also a marriage of not just the military rule, but also the rule of the Muslim Brotherhood, which also brought in different realities and contexts to the country. In terms of the foreign relations, in addition to the control of the political life, the control of the economy, highly referred to a percentage of 70%, but also that's what's been calculated. There are also a lot of reports of the gold and the oil exports that is not actually have been calculated within the budget. But I think one of the other key factors that have proved important in this conflict is also the control of the foreign relations. We all remember Bashir regime due to the ideological link leaning towards Iran and then changing cap towards the Saudis in joining the war in Yemen, which kind of have been the earlier signs of bringing the Rapid Support Forces, formerly the Janjaweed, to engage in that arena and to get more power in terms of foreign relations, access to arms and wealth and power within the region. I think a key factor within the military and the role of the military since the early days is this idea and this phenomenon of paramilitias or paraforces is not new to the Sudan armed forces. I think during the war on South Sudan, we have seen what was called the Popular Defense Forces at the time, and that used the ideological kind of narrative and the religious narrative in the war in South Sudan at the time. During the war in Darfur, I think that was not possible to use that religious kind of argument in the war in Darfur. And we have seen forces like Musa Hilal, like the Janjaweed have also been utilized. And that borrowed more of an ethnic lens to that conflict and to these paramilitia groups. And I think the RSF, or the Rapid Support Forces that we see today, is a continuation of that heritage of the military controlling economy, controlling the foreign relations, and then the paramilitary aspect of it that have been utilized differently. Maybe coming to your question, Tundi, in terms of within this context, and in a context of war, reason is always missing. And I think the ethnic division, but also the division of also created by the role of external actors into creating more realignment and division within local actors has also been extremely important in this context. I think for the civic actors, with the war has been like the culmination of failure of addressing the questions of statehood and nationhood in Sudan historically. It's also been a Pandora box of opening all of the differences, whether it's ethnic, whether of over managing the resources within the different regions of Sudan. And I think there is a series of dialogues that we are seeing within local actors that are taking place around the main political blocks within civil society, within women groups, within youth groups. It's useful to say, I think, that a third force or a third actor, aside from the RSF and SAF, a civilian voice that brings together political actors that also kind of address the main argument and the reasoning and the rationale and justification for the conflict and the narratives that have been used to kind of continue with it. You have on one side of the RSF claiming that this is a conflict to address the issue of the peripheries and to address the central government and the central state. You have a narrative from the army saying that this is a fight for the dignity of the country and for the legitimate institution. In my view, neither narrative is actually like have a fair basis if we look at the history that we've just highlighted. But again, for a civic actor to come and to be able to address these narratives and create a new discourse for a potential of a country that is ruled through a civic government, and to address this increasing hate speech and polarization that we are seeing would require a series of negotiations and dialogue between political actors. And I think part of that is happening between the four main political blocs, but also the civilian movement has been, there is also a contestation from the armed groups, and they're trying to pull the civilians to their side. So we continue to see this realignment of positions along ethnic lines, along political lines. For instance, with the news that whatever happens in Al-Fashir, for instance, in North Darfur, we expect that will also have serious implications in reorganizing both camps supporting the SAF side and the RSF side, and would further create more divisions within civilian actors based on ethnic and geographical lines. I think one element that would be important to highlight is, while this effort of civilian organizing takes place, it is going to be very difficult, especially with the inability to convene or have political discussions inside the country, both in the sites that are controlled now by SAF or by RSF, and then also within this reality of displacement and people in different countries with very difficult economic situation, to organize and to convene is also becoming extremely difficult, and making a lot of actors dependent on organizations and external actors to help them convene and organize. I think one key point here is also, although we expect this organizing to create a new kind of narrative and a cause to convene and discuss what is the political vision to end the war, address some of the key contentious issues like, if Sudan is to remain a united country, what kind of formula for governance, specifically to address the demands for decentralization and for self-rule from the regions. How would we look at that new kind of dispensation of Sudan? And the key question of the security sector governance, which has been attributed to be one of the main reasons to this conflict of civilians for the first time discussing a reform and a new formula, and to really address the role of the military in the state and addressing the economic control, but also demanding a civilian oversight over the military. And I think, again, this is a second key contentious issue that would have to be addressed. And of course, within that, the question of how do we deal with the previous regime in terms of justice and accountability, in terms of the control of the security institutions, how do we deal with the RSF as well? How do we deal with the demands and the interests of the neighboring countries? And I know Dawn and Mesgana will highlight the regional dynamics, but it's also, I wouldn't say it's a proxy conflict yet, but I would say there is a huge impact of the continuation of the conflict from the supply lines and the financial support that is being extended through the region. I think just the last point here is, while the role of local actors is important into trying to figure out how do we end the war, address some of these questions and engage, including with the belligerents, the issue of the role of external actors will require more of an external and regional political will to address this issue of the interest of external actors from within the region and beyond, from the Gulf. Address the issue of the supply lines, the weapons that are being extended. And again, it's not an issue only targeting Sudan. I think Haile's points to the regional formation and alignment and the issue of the Red Sea puts it in a regional perspective that really requires a wider angle looking into it. Tunde, I know you're looking at me, and I'll stop here and hopefully come back later. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. We're very keen to open the floor now because we have to allow participants, virtual as well as physical, to ask questions and clarify. But while we're doing that, Asma, again, still on the issue of civilian action, civil actors' participation, there is obviously the issue of partisanship, you know, the taking sides, you know, by either, you know, the main groups as we know them, without mentioning names, as well as those that are non-affiliated. It will be good to hear your thoughts on that at some point. At this point, and thanks again, thank you very much for that. Maybe we should now allow for questions, comments from within. Because of time, unfortunately, we have to really be concise, respectfully. If you would kindly just keep to your questions without, you know, giving a lot of context or analysis, it would be good so that we can allow the speakers to respond. So, Eka, perhaps we can take 2 questions online and then 2 from here as well. And then we give the speakers 3.5 minutes each to respond. And then we go to the next segment. Shuvai, I hope you agree with this format. All right. Thank you.
Thank you very much. See, okay. We have one question online, which I've put there. What peacebuilding models have proven effective in other conflict zones in the Horn of Africa, and how might they be adapted for Sudan? Thank you, Galila. I see you. This is our co-lead at IPSS, the Addis Ababa University, for Cluster of Research Excellence on Interdisciplinary. So wonderful to see them there with us. I see, sorry, I'm seeing questions both on and in the chat as okay, no, that's the same one. Right, one question. Another one online. Can you please say more on the role of the UAE, Egypt, and Eritrea? Those are the 2 questions we have from online. Now let's take 2 questions in the room. I saw Gloriana's hand go up and a hand there. Please tell us who you are as you speak as well. Please, Gloriana first, and I come to you, please.
Good evening. I'm tempted to stand up because I'm not Nigerian, so my voice will not echo. I'm Gloriana Rodriguez. I'm a lecturer at the African Leadership Center. And I think what really struck me was the brief history of the military. And so my question is because, I teach a governance of security course. And so often we talk about the need to bring security under a democratic form of governance, under civilian governance. But based on what was said, it seems like in this case, the military doesn't just need to be democratized, it potentially needs to be decolonized. So my question is, what is the role of the military, if any, in more peaceful?
Question one, thank you, please.
Hi, so I know to stand up as well. My name is Maurizio D'Antona, and I work in several countries in the Horn of Africa. And basically, because we're short of time, I go straight to the point. So there is lots of fragmentation in these societies, and several reasons are being highlighted by Mr. Ali. However, there is external actors as well. So I know it's not easy to find a solution, particularly in the current global socio-political / economic climate, and because of the wars in Ukraine, Gaza, Lebanon, you name it. So do the panelists think that the solution has to be inward-looking, so towards the internal actors, meaning NGOs, political parties, the Ethiopian society, Sudanese societies, or mainly from UAE, the Americans, the Russians, or a combination of both, and the intervention of international community as well? Thank you.
We can always.
I think we said 2 and 2. Can you take more?
I have a question quickly, and then we go back to the speakers, please.
Please, our student as well.
Thank you so much. My name is Jeffrey. I'm a fellow of the ALC. I also happen to be a former Sudanese. Because I was half Sudanese. Yeah. So the context of my question is that it appears that it's impossible to bring peace without the two generals, Hemeti and Burhan. And it's also impossible to end the war without them. Now, if that is safe to say, I'll read for you an extract from my president in 2018, just before the peace deal was signed, and when there was all sorts of pressure pushing him to sign the peace deal. And he says, they think that I am the obstacle to peace. And if I am removed after signing the agreement, then there will be no problem. They want me to sign the agreement and then step down immediately. What is my incentive? On the basis of that, what would be the incentives for these two gentlemen? Thank you.
Can I throw in a couple more questions? And our speakers, you can also decide. I think some can be
Some are
grouped as
similar.
well. Yes, exactly. So thank you so much, colleagues, for really engaging with this. Yeah. I see one here, thanking for the insights. How much influence do you think Omar al-Bashir has on the two warring parties, and what are the odds that he will be the missing link for the much-needed ceasefire? One. We have Abdulaziz, a doctoral student from Nigeria, who would like to hear thoughts from the panelists on the role of Nigeria and other African nations in peace building in Sudan. There are others, colleagues, keep them coming. We'll try and come back to them. But let me pause there. I think that's a very rich collection of questions. Can I say, our panelists, you've heard what you've inspired, really, by those very rich contributions. So thank you so much for those contributions.
We start with Asma and then come to Haile. Asma, would you like to take on some of those questions? And then
Thank you. No, I think maybe Tundi, to start with your point about the increasing polarization and trying to pull civilian actors to one of the sides. I think in a way that's also is a tactic that have been used in the past by the previous regime in terms of a continuation of a divide and conquer. So that I think is one. I think the second is also part of it is a realization that if and when it comes to more engagement on a civilian, especially the platform and the mandate of the African Union, that in addition to having a table for the belligerents, everyone also wants to influence what will be kind of a political agreement from that. Three, I think also the dynamics on the ground in terms of territorial control, the continuation of the conflict on the ground is also going to continue to be a factor to pull and push some of the stakeholders based on ethnic, based on addressing the polarization that is increasingly being used through social media for recruitment purposes, to mobilize based on ethnic, based on atrocities that are happening on the ground. So I think that is a factor that will continue, and I think that's the nature of any conflict across. But I think despite that, being able to see a third voice that is not bending down and continuing to call for peace, because now that is also increasingly being a crime. If you call for stopping the war, like one of the parties will say that you are associated with the other. So there's increased criminalization of the call for peace, even though it sounds like a common sense, that is not the fact, I think, in the context. I think with regard to the role of the region, I don't really need to go into details of that. I think there's well-founded report and analysis everywhere, but I think it's really important to try and think beyond about what are the interests and what kind of, how do we really address this issue of interest. I would dare say that there is a space for dialogue. I think even with the long history of association between the Egyptian army and the Sudanese army, to really a discussion about what is the interest of Egypt in terms of security, and would a war and basically a destruction of Sudan as a country, as a united country, a destruction of the security institution, is it really of the interest of the Egyptian state in terms of security at its southern borders? And I think even the misconception about how these interests could be achieved is again an area for deep conversation and deeper analysis. And I think one of the issues that we have seen throughout the years from the Gulf or from Egypt is they might be intelligence, they might be information, but I think sometimes the analysis and a deeper dialogue of what are the interests and what are the abilities of the civic actors sometimes is missed in terms of calculation. And I think that these are still continue to be areas for conversation. Again, looking at the role of UAE, I think it's also looking within the entire region. If we look at recent exchanges with Egypt or with Chad, or just the recent visit to South Sudan, or even the question of the role of Ethiopia or Somalia, I think again there is a space for a united, coordinated regional discussion around the interests of the Gulf and the relationship with the Gulf. For instance, the issue of the Red Sea. There's no treaty for the Red Sea in terms of security or trade. The countries of the Horn, and one would dare to say that some of the proxy conflicts that are happening on the shores of the Red Sea of Africa, there's no platform for a dialogue. The Saudis have proposed this Red Sea Council. There was a counter proposal from the AU and from Egypt. But up to now, we don't have a shared space for dialogue as Africans or as a Horn of Africa. And I think some of these platforms could address some of these issues. The issue of the GERD, again, I think that's another platform where some of these regional actors and regional issues would need to be discussed. And again, it's not looking at Sudan conflict separately. I think that's important to look at the regional and external actors, but I think looking at the regional issues that also require separate platforms and spaces for dialogue would also be important and complementary to look at peacemaking in Sudan. Maybe just to take a third question before I hand over to you, Tundi and Haile, is I think the question from Gloria about, if I understood you correctly, I think the voice wasn't clear, so you can blame it on the late time at my end if I didn't get it as well. I think the question about the role of the military is, if we are looking at this war taking us to the drawing board of what Sudan is as a state. If we're to get out of it, we'll have to reimagine the state and its institution. And one key part of that is to really look at the role of the military historically, and to look at what would the role of the military be, A, vis-a-vis governance, B, an administration, B, issue of resources and economy, and 3, in terms of foreign relations as well. And I think there have been a lot of pushback for that. And the war, in my view, one of its key objectives is to maintain that power and dominance of the military within the state. So again, I think one of the key contentious topic is the issue of the security sector governance and the fate of the military and the fate of RSF and the role of the military in the state in totality, if we are to get to a modality or a framework for a deal or a peace agreement altogether. Maybe let me stop here and hand over to you, Hailey. And of course, if there is time, happy to come back on any of the points.
Hailey?
Yeah.
You could,
But just to point some to I think the coming of the Islamist regime, created a spanner in what was possible for Sudan. Sudan was a melting pot, actually, and very tolerant society also, historically or even now. It is this coming of this Islam. The war against the South, for example, was an anti-insurgency war. And as long as it was anti-insurgency, Africa is very allergic to the idea of separatist movements. And all of them were supportive, actually, of Sudan, anti-separation, because it's a fragile state, formed as they are by the colonial powers without recourse to history. But then minute Turabi came up and changed what was an anti-insurgency fight into a jihad. The minute it became a jihad, then antennas went up in Africa for so it is the Muslims against the Christians. So it is the Arabs against the Africans. And then the whole thing shifted, and the Americans found a golden opportunity, who wanted to fight against the Islamist regime that was supportive of Islamist extremist movements, throughout the globe. And, so these are, in other words, hated by Africans, racist, and in fact, a golden opportunity actually to fight against the Bashir regime, and it lost at the end. The negotiation that was going on in Kenya through IGAD would not have succeeded if it did not have the full support of the Troika. You remember the Troika, the UK, the US, and Norway. They were the main force actually behind it, and eventually they wanted. The region did not want independence of South Sudan. The feeling was, if the South was to be excised from the North, which is more Arab, the North will go Arab, and we will lose it as an active member of the region. If we want Sudan to be anchored in this region, there's no way it can be Arab with the South, with all the other African elements, and therefore they did not want a separation of Sudan. But the Islamization of the government, of the regime, this adoption of an Islamic ideology. I remember, when I was leaving, I had to say goodbye. So Bashir, I had to see Bashir, I had to see Turabi also. And then they started telling me, how do you feel, about having presided over the dissolution of Sudan, the separation of Sudan? I was really angry. I said, you are responsible for that. You changed what was anti-insurgency into a jihad. And the minute you did that, you lost. You made unity unattractive. You failed to make unity attractive. And if this is the process, South Sudan is the beginning. There will be Darfur next. There will be Kordofan. There will be Southern Blue Nile. All of these most likely are going to go as long as you are caught up with this ideology of a sectarian ideology. It's a sectarian ideology, whereas it is. And it's still, well, it still has been continuing, really. It may not be exactly, but who controls the South now? I mean, everybody sort of, it's not the South that is actually fighting. It is the Islamist, in other words, militias that are being formed by some actors within the army that are Islamist, is what is being said. So this is at the crux of the whole problem, really, in Sudan. As long as this is not changed and they adopt the fact that Sudan is multi-ethnic, multi-religious, multicultural, and they have an institution, a government that is federal, perhaps, as many of them do want, and secular. Unless it adopts this that unites all Sudanese, it would be very difficult to find a solution in Sudan. What has started disintegrating as a separation of South Sudan will continue perhaps into the other regions as well. And therefore, what kind of a solution is a solution that recognizes the reality of Sudan? That is what is going to be, whether it is internally generated, eventually it has to be internalized, but whoever comes actually to try to help them must realize this nature of what is Sudan, the population of Sudan, and base it on that. I will stop there. There are many questions, interesting questions, but I think this is the crux of the matter, the critical issue in Sudan.
Thank you very much, Haile. I'm trying to move along quickly to the other segment. I would, do a quick recital of Meskinal's profile, and then Shubai, would you help with Donald's as well? Perhaps up to you. Would you like to go first?
All right, I do Donald. And
yes, and then I do.
Okay, so we're going to hear from our other two panelists now, but please keep your questions if you still have questions, and in the next round we can ask them to all the panelists. But thank you very much to Ambassador Menkarius and to Asma. So we have on the line Mr. Donald Daya, who is an advocate of the High Court of Kenya and was previously the CEO of the East Africa Law Society, and before that, Deputy CEO of the Law Society of Kenya. He's also worked with the Kenyan section of the International Commission of Jurists, and while at EALS, he founded the East African Civil Society Organizations Forum. Among other things, he chairs the executive committees of the Pan-African Citizens Network, PACIN, which works directly with citizens on the African Union, and it was formerly called CCPAU, Center for Citizens Participation in the African Union, and the International Coalition for the Responsibility to Protect. And he's a former chair of the African Court Coalition and is a counselor and former secretary of the African Forum for the International Bar Association. Don, as we call him, also litigates extensively with the African Court on Human and People's Rights, and is one of the most knowledgeable people on certain aspects of the African Union, especially issues like the court and on various human rights issues. Don is also Don and Palu, the organization that he heads, are also part of a Pan-African coalition called Africans for the Horn of Africa, which specifically looks at civil society engagement more broadly with issues in the Horn of Africa. We also have with us Meskinal Mulugeta, who is the program manager for Ethiopia and South Sudan at the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue, overseeing peacemaking and humanitarian mediation efforts in the two countries. Prior to HD, he assumed various leadership and senior advisor positions in the public development and academic sectors, including working as a director at the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission and serving as a senior governance advisor at the UK Department for International Development, DFID, and Irish Aid. He holds 2 master's degrees from Sweden, a very busy guy, and an LLM in International Human Rights Law from Lund University, and an MA in Global Political Studies with a specialization in Peace and Conflict Studies from Malmo University. He's a 2014 Fellow of the Mandela Washington Fellowship for Young African Leaders and a 2022 Public Policy Chevening Fellow. We have other Chevening scholars in the room as well, so you're in good company. Don and Mescanao, both your orientations are also towards human rights and human rights issues, which we know is a very, very central component of this conflict and conflict in the region more broadly. Ambassador Mankarius talked about the solution to Sudan being focused on the reality of Sudan and also the reality of the situation of people, ordinary people. Today, I think, is the third or fourth day of 16 days of activism on violence against women. And we have seen that one of the most terrible aspects of this conflict in Sudan, but in the region as a whole, are the human rights violations, the experiences of the people. And so, Don, to you first, and also to you, Mescanao, if you could touch on how do you match or bring together, because oftentimes we see human rights violations, humanitarian situation becoming a byline or used to advertise conflict. But how do you, in the solutions that we are thinking about, how do the realities and experiences of ordinary Sudanese who are still caught up daily in this conflict, how do they feed into solutions or commitment to solutions to these conflicts? So Don, first to you, and then Mescanao to you.
Thank you, Shuvai, and thank you also, Babatunde, and of course to my sister Asma and Ambassador Haile, I think, for setting the ground very, very well. I think that's a very hard question to answer, Shuvai. We are operating at a time when, one, the world has clearly shown us that it doesn't care about us. The world and those that run it, who are mostly from the global north, care more about their own issues that happen in Europe and so on, or their own approach to issues such as Ukraine, Israel, Gaza, and so on. That means that we have to forge ways of caring about ourselves, especially across the African regions and across the African continent, that work. And the second unfortunate thing is that we are, for several reasons, at a point whereby key regional institutions that could have provided this crucial leadership role in facilitating or forcing the resolution of the complex issues in Sudan as an individual country, or in the Horn, because as you've correctly said, they're all interconnected, that these institutions are really at the weakest they have been in 2 decades. And I'm looking here at the AU, the African Union, and its various panoply of organs, institutions, specialized agencies, and ad hoc mechanisms, and even IGAD. They are at the weakest. So if you look at the very instrumental approach with which we have been handling these complex issues, like, oh, we've got a protocol on that, we've got a peace and security protocol, we've got a peace and security council, we've got an African human rights system, we can lodge complaints at the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, simply don't work. We are now at 1.5 years, and all these things put together have not yet provided even respite for our comrades in Sudan and in the Horn. So really what we need is a new Pan-Africanism. A new Pan-Africanism is, in my view, the most ideal way to deal with this world that does not care about us and institutions that are letting us down. Hence initiatives like Africans for the Horn of Africa that you've talked about. Instrumentally, there are things we could do in terms of navigating the rules that the AU has formed for itself. But I doubt that going into depth on those now, like for instance, filing complaints at the African Commission, which has been there to try to issue some statements, maybe try and create some linkage between the African Commission and the Peace and Security Council, those can be done. But I don't think they will be sufficient. The other thing to add, and I'll add there and stop there, because I think a really revolutionary moment is required. Major crises in Africa before have contributed to revolutionary overhaul of African institutions and even of African social movements. If you look again at the genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda in 1994, it was one of the main contributing factors to a chain of events that led to the transformation from the OAU into the AU. And I think that the most important thing that I can say right now is how do we as a collective grab this moment and the urgent imperative to save lives in the Horn and in Sudan to occasion another major overhaul in what we have to deal with the challenges we're dealing with. How do we massively mobilize African citizen solidarity and African citizen anger and use this to revolutionize how we're dealing with this problem? Because what we have as of now is not enough. Maybe I stop there for a moment.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Don. Ms. Janelle, how do we mobilize African citizen anger?
That's a question for all of us.
Yeah.
No, I mean, the question you raised around accountability, human rights violation is very important. And I think that's one of the reasons these conflicts continue, because we don't address these past grievances, we don't address the gross violations of human rights, and a lot of gross violations happen in a context of conflict. And I think I'll just make a couple of points. One is the global trend of armed conflicts being protracted and fragmented is a reality in the Horn of Africa. We've seen patterns of a lot of these conflicts. Ethiopia was very prominent 2 years ago, if you remember. Now it's Sudan, and there are also other conflicts marinating. And a lot of them are interrelated in a lot of ways. And therefore, in a lot of ways, one impacts the other. We can pick the example of how the Sudan conflict affected South Sudan, which is already a fragile post-conflict situation with the 2018 revitalized peace agreement. But when the Sudan conflict happened and the oil pipes stopped, the economy was really draining, which accounts basically for 60% of the revenue. So South Sudan basically became a humanitarian economy, a lot of strains on the economy, and then a lot of returnees from Sudan also exacerbating the conflict situation. So you see these patterns of one conflict in one of the countries creating a favorable condition for the instability of others. And of course, you have really open borders, so arms trade is there. There is a conflict economy really operating in that region. So I think one is related to the other. And that sort of puts you to the question, and somebody asked it earlier, what examples of peacemaking can be taken from the Horn's experience? Mm-hmm. And I think two examples can be mentioned. One is the revitalized peace agreement, which broadly is still sticking in South Sudan in terms of ceasefires. Of course, there are pockets of instability. It has still not sort of graduated into a sustainable peace momentum. And the other is Pretoria in February 2022. And this also signals some sort of a peace agreement. And I think there is a pattern in both of them. The first pattern is these armed conflicts are not becoming winnable. So at the end of the day, you have a lot of sacrifices, a lot of civilian deaths, but you still would have some agreement to coexist. And so you have to really define in a post-agreement era, how do you coexist? So the question around political arrangements, but also the question around accountability should come in here. So I think a lot of these conflicts affect civilians, a lot of civilian deaths. The Tigray conflict, as you remember, is one of those that consumes the lives of many. I think the biggest in the 21st century. But then, unless you have some sort of ceasefires is operating, silencing the guns is great. But in terms of accountability, we need some serious issues in terms of transitional justice that has an element of prosecutions holding those to account, but also truth-making, healing, and reconstruction. Unless you have these pillars in place, chances of falling back to these conflicts are exacerbated. And I think my last point on this is peacemaking efforts in the region are very, so the states, there are constant alliances, realliances within the states in those countries, and therefore finding a peacemaking actor, a state peacemaking actor has become very difficult because one will be seen as, and everybody wants to play it neutral, at least to a certain extent that the power dynamics change. So that's what we're seeing. But I think one conclusion can be drawn is that as a preventive tool, our institutions have failed us, both the AU and the IGAD and all the others. The little effect they have is at least post-conflict trying to seek an agreement, a peace agreement. That's what was seen In Ethiopia, that's what we're seeing in South Sudan. But the institutions we have regionally, while we have a lot of tensions throughout a lot of countries, both internally and among countries, our AU institutions, other institutions that are supposed to prevent this conflict from erupting, are constantly failing us. And that's where we need to rethink, in terms of a preventive mechanism, do we really need to look for new models? And I think I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So I think, Ms. Ganal, you have said the peace agreements are potentially, so for instance, in South Sudan and on Tigray, potentially an option, although my comeback to you but where are the people? I mean, the Tigrayan peace agreement didn't have a single woman. The then Minister of Foreign Affairs for South Africa said that this peace agreement essentially has failed because in 2022. In 2022, without a single woman in a delegation for a peace agreement. Our axis in South Sudan, it's still generally holding, but the can keeps being kicked down the road. Yeah. And the question comes back, where are the people, right? Don, what is this new Pan-Africanism that you are talking about? How do we harness it? I don't want the two of you to answer now because we're going to go to our room, both our virtual room and our physical room, but I'm just planting those questions to respond to some of your very inspirational, interventions. But how do we make this happen, whether as academics or scholars, as we have many of those in the room, but also people who are in civil society or people who are in the policy spaces, many of whom we have online. So I think we will come back now to take some questions. We will take a few in the room, but we have quite a lot of comments that have come online. I'm not sure, Tunde and Eka, if you've been able to capture some of them. But is there anyone okay, we have a couple in the room, so we'll start in the room and then we'll come online this time. So please go ahead. Don't forget to say who you are.
So my name is Issa Williams. I'm writing my PhD on actually the role of the state as the driver of conflict in Africa. So I'm particularly interested in this topic. But Ambassador, I just wanted to ask, you did mention earlier that the state and the military exist as separate entities, that the military basically is a law unto itself. In terms of peace and leadership, in the quest for peace in Sudan, has there been a failure in the leadership in not being able to build a conduit in which they can talk directly to the military, to where the tensions could be, at the very least, they're talking and could be eased for a start? And if that's possible to be created, can that also be replicated elsewhere in Africa, where the military tend to breathe over the necks of civilian governments?
Thank you. Do we have another question in the room? Yes.
It's not really a question this time. It's a little insight, if you don't mind. We spoke, sorry if I go nominally, we spoke of South Sudan, Ethiopia, the conflict in Tigray. By my own opinion, humble opinion, we cannot forget Somalia. Because Somalia is the center of very harsh conflict between governments. There is still some chronic infighting. And Somaliland, as he said it, as Mr. Ali said. So I think it's important to take Somalia into account. That's what I wanted to say.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Randolph, you have a question?
No.
Okay.
So yes, I mean, if there's no one else who has a question, because I'm fascinated by what we really are talking about the present, and obviously one understands why. But let me pose something. I wondered if, so to speak, your children or future children will actually begin to see what we call, and what we'll increasingly call, if you like, a post-Westphalian world. The assumptions we make about, if you like, the inherent viability of the state, I think we have to look differently at that. And an example, not in Africa, is Latvia, which is now becoming more and more a virtual state. And my question is, if you take a look the technologies that we can anticipate within a foreseeable future in like 20 years, 10, 20 years, will that change the very makeup of what Africa is? And will it change the very construct of what we need as a state? I just thought I'd ask that little question.
Thank you very much, Randolph. And Randolph Kent is a visiting professor at the African Leadership Center at King. There's a question at the back, and then I'll take the last one here before we move to online. Please go ahead and let us know who you are.
Yeah, I think let me start. Okay, my name is Lokwani. I am a concerned citizen. I'm from Ethiopia. So my question is, in Sudan, there are 3 external bodies that have got interest, like Ethiopia, Eritrea, and Egypt. I don't know, you talk about more about these interests. And I just want to know what are the intentions behind, because if you see the leaders of this conflict are traveling frequently to Egypt, everywhere in Ethiopia. And is there anything, especially Ambassador Haile, if you can share your experience between the Ethiopia, Israel, and Sudan in terms of Sudan? And thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, let me take the hand that I saw first, and I'll come back to you, I promise.
Yeah, very quickly, perhaps an angle a bit more kind of cross-regional on the question. My name is Marian. I work for the Environment and Conflict Team at Crisis Group. So I wanted to kind of, link the kind of climate issue to drivers of political instability in the Horn. The security implications of climate are more and more acknowledged, yet communities, I don't think, are sufficiently supported in handling conflicts, localized conflicts linked to the lack of resources and climate shocks. So to understand maybe the space for dialogue and peace in this context, how can communities think through pathways for sustainable peace where the climate context generates maybe further political instability and kind of competition for resources? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Jeffrey, can you help us with any questions online? Are there any, or it's mostly?
There are several, actually.
Several, okay. You can group them and, yes.
Some are comments though. Some are related to the questions that have been posted. But let me read a few. To my brother Don, thank you for raising the need to reimagine Pan-Africanism. Kindly, how do you evaluate the role of African Union peace and security architecture in addressing conflicts like the one in Sudan? What does it take for Article 4 of the Constitutive Act of the AU to be triggered? This is 1.5, I think. And then James Yao says, to what degree do you think the Thabo Mbeki 2009 final recommendations were implemented? How could the implementation, how could have the implementation prevented or fueled the current crisis?
There's one below that, Alexa.
Yes. Alexa says, is the said and admittedly much needed African revolution not wishful thinking? As long as the AU appears rather timid in its actions, and as long as Africa does not have a permanent seat on the AU Security Council, whose members are among those plundering the continent's resources.
All right, can you give us
just a few?
Just one.
One more?
One more.
Okay, there is also the Q&A book here. Yeah. All right.
We dealt with that one? No, we didn't.
Did you deal with any of these?
There's an ICC one that looks interesting.
Akande says the ICC is one of the institutions that was tackling issues in the conflicts, what would be the impact of Western nations who are recently maligning these institutions?
Thank you very, very much. So, panelists, you can choose what you'd like to respond to. I'll give you a minute and a half, and then we will come back for other questions to add to the plate. And you can also, again, respond to what you would like. Ms. Ganal, can I start with you? And then Asma will come to you, then Ambassador Mankarios, and then we'll end with Don in this round. Is that okay, Tunde?
Sure, absolutely. Thank you.
I'll start with the inclusivity question. Inclusivity is lacking in a lot of these processes. Unfortunately, a lot of these peace processes are highly hierarchical. I mean, there is at some point a way of looking at this in terms of you will need, NHD does that as an organization. We look at this, there is this high level peacemaking processes, which we call track 1, and you have track 2 type of processes where you, even if you have a peace agreement or not, in order to hold it, you need some elite consensus. A piece of agreement doesn't necessarily mean the conflict will be resolved. In fact, the statistics shows a lot of peace deals fail through, right? So in order to stick them, you need to do that multi-level interventions where you do elite level dialogues, processes, and then even community level dialogues, where I think that a lot of the climate change issues must come in, because in a lot of these conflicts, this climate stress in some of the countries sustains the conflicts. So I think there is a way to look at this to deconstruct these processes in those ways. And when you do that, you have a lot of rooms for inclusivity. Otherwise, a piece of example on the Ethiopia, which you mentioned, and we've done some studies sort of to understand why it was not an inclusive process. And you have all the answers from the parties, including there are no competent Tuma. I mean, a lot of them are not, will not satisfy you. So I think one of the things to do is to mobilize the public around them, the sustenance of these peace deals, but also to deconstruct peace processes into these levels so that you have a lot of entry points to push for more inclusivity. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Ms. Ganal. Asma, we'll come to you. I hope she's still, yeah.
Yes, I am. Thanks for that, and thanks for the interesting conversation and the questions. Maybe just to highlight 2 points is on the role of the African Union. And I think since the onset of the conflict, we have been really focusing on the secretariat, like the issues around the perception to the chairperson and the different instruments. But I think, again, like mentioned earlier, a focus on what are the role of the member states in general is key. There are a few from the audience highlighted to the role of a country like Nigeria. And I would say that is still not to the level that a country like Nigeria could play, especially looking at the tribal and the cultural and the affinity of the population of Sudan that is from origins from that region of the continent. And again, I think within the current pressures and the current interests of external actors, I just reiterate the point that I think there's a lack of satisfaction to the role of the AU. Don have highlighted it, and I think he already started a conversation about the revolution within the AU that is necessary and required. But I think back to Tundi's question earlier about whether a new chairperson era could change it, I think to some extent, but without the political will from the neighbors, particularly of Sudan, and from a push from member states like we've seen in the past, I'm afraid even some hopes that of a new chairperson who could push this agenda would not materialize. And again, just on the solution and the peacemaking, I think it's part of it is homegrown, but to a large extent, they need to be a formula that would accompany the neighboring countries, because ultimately they would have interest and engagement. I think someone mentioned Ethiopia and Eritrea, and I think Haile would be best suited. But I cannot imagine a formula for a peace deal that cannot really bring in the region and look into the interests of external actors at this point. I think on the climate, like the whole discussion about the situation of Darfur and where we are now and the current context since the 80s and the famine and the situation in the 80s that have really changed the economic activities and the livelihood in Darfur, and that the previous government at that time of Sadiq al-Mahdi addressed. I think it started the whole conflict in that area in terms of not being able to address this issue of the nomadic tribes in that area and the issue of the agriculture. So we could say that it's been one of the major issues that have not been really addressed since that time. Now looking at the situation of the migration of people, the displacement, the situation of the dire situation of food security, that famine have been declared in some of the areas, and the recent floods that have accelerated the situation, I think, again, it's another factor that need to be looked at. Just briefly, I think since the conflict, there have been calls for ceasefire for agriculture. There have been discussions about local agreements between communities, looking to address some of that, particularly after the floods, of how do we address the issue of agriculture, how do we still look into the issue of the grazing sites and to look into this factor. But I think the main issue of the insecurity and the constant kind of mobility of people is really not allowing sufficient conversation. But again, in recent peace agreements that have been signed in Juba or previously, this issue of looking at the climate, looking at the environment have featured significantly. And I think it's worth further focus and engagement on any solution moving forward. Over to you, Shul.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Asma. Ambassador.
Yes, thank you. Just a few points. Number one, the role of the army, for example, in Africa, it is significant. In fact, the military, since it was unified, since it was sort of national in nature, not just ethnic, it played a role in maintaining the unity of a rather fragmented, fragile sort of state created by the colonial, So that role, it did play for quite some time. The question is, it became an institution unto itself. You see, when it becomes an institution of maintaining the unity of a country, yes, indeed, it played this role in Sudan and in other places as well. And there are many who look at it as an instrument for the country is going to fall apart if that military is not there. I mean, there is a certain truth to that. At what cost is the thing. And it is being challenged when that military sits over the hierarchy of a class that is exploitative, and people rise up against this exploitation. And this is exactly what happened in Sudan. Not only was it against the government, but it was against the military also. They understood exactly where the power of the military was, its control of the resources of the country. And you remember they formed a committee to dismantle that ownership of the resources in the country, going for the kill, actually. That's what would have done to the military, strip it over its source of power in the country. And immediately, what happened? A coup. The coup. It had supported actually the transition. Of course, it had control through the Sovereign Council. It controlled it to a degree, but then it got complete control when this, I don't know what the name of the commission was, Asma, remind me. A committee was formed to strip all the resources the military controls and put it in the hands of the state. And that is when, this is serious, actually they united together. In fact, both the RSF and the SAF sat together. Well, it is still a very strong institution. Look, it's crippling, the government in the country. It is causing human disaster unseen, in fact, anywhere at the moment. It is the biggest disaster, humanitarian disaster in the country. And it is the two, actually, factions of the army slugging it out without an ideological difference. You can't say if one wins, what different of a state, of a system is it going to bring? And yet it is the reality. It is there. It has control. And if the devil is creating havoc in your house and you don't have the capacity to deal with him, you better start talking to him. And therefore, eventually, you've got to include that military in a solution, a transitional solution to where the military will have its role of just an institution of the state with funding coming from the state rather than owning itself. I think that about the military. The AU, the African Union cannot be expected to be much more bigger and more effective than the sum of the constituents that form it. Now, in each, we see actually a lot of struggle. Many governments, it has deteriorated, in fact, in terms of ideology, in terms of collective thinking, up to the level where there was agreement to form this African, in other words, economic zone, free trade actually between African countries. Up to that time, it was actually making positive promises. Its implementation, it is the fact that Africa does not exist in a vacuum. It exists actually among, when that came, for example, there was an attempt to block African trade with the West, starting with the Americans. I remember with the vice president of Nigeria, we were discussing with the Americans actually that they were going to bring a new phase, and we said all Africa wants is for you to open your markets actually to African products. Open your markets. Otherwise, you want to keep Africa a source of raw materials only, and you invest in the extraction in the extractive industries, just to, including the earth, the dust with it, no processing going on in Africa, then we don't want handouts. What we want is fair trade. Fair trade, actually. Definitely it doesn't exist now. Fair trade has become less now than it was before. And that impacts actually in Africa. You've seen how much we were dependent on the international economic situation after the war in Ukraine. It was amazing actually to see how dependent we were even for the production of food. Food production, food prices shot up because wheat was being exported actually from Ukraine, and oil prices went up, and everything has to be transported, and therefore this deteriorated the economy of the country. Fertilizers, the cost of fertilizers went up. And, even the demonstrations in Kenya, they're directly actually connected to what extent African countries are still dependent on a global economy, which controls. So for that to change, for Africa to be really independent, to have independent institutions, independent initiatives, we will have to work a lot on controlling the resources we have and creating an economic cooperation that is South-South, that is within Africa itself. And that's why I said, the new generation. I'm very optimistic really that the new generation has to do. The AU, the Peace and Security Council of the African Union, it was very robust at one point. In fact, it was passing resolutions which Africa then didn't follow up actually to implement. It can't. It was dependent on the Security Council too. And look what the African Union is. In the UN, there is a working Security Council. There is a working General Assembly. I was an ambassador there, and we met. And we corresponded with our governments and make decisions even. The African Union doesn't. A representative of any African country doesn't. It's the heads of state. It's all dependent on heads of state. African Union takes decisions when there is a summit. It does not take decisions in between, unless it's the heads of state. The ambassadors, the permanent ambassadors there, I was one, we didn't have any power at all. And the same thing with the Peace and Security Council. It passes certain resolutions, but does not have the instrument of enforcing what decisions it made. Even with the Security Council, there are 3 members of the Security Council. Yes, they are not permanent members. They don't have the veto power. We should be thinking of eliminating veto powers rather than wanting veto power ourselves in the first place. But there is no coordination between the Peace and Security Council and what are called the A3 in Sudan, for example. They're voting with the government against actually with the military. Simply because that is what is represented actually over there. So there is quite a lot that you asked about what is the possibility of the future. There is a discussion now going globally. What do we do now? Again, the East and West, they are conflicting amongst themselves, and we are just being left, actually the consequences are negative consequences we are getting. Why don't we form, a new Bandung? For those of you, a new Bandung, actually, and some of us are saying, no more Bandung. Why should we define ourselves by the superpowers? That we have to be non-aligned. It's either aligned or non-aligned. No, there should be a global movement that leads to, okay, the League of, the Council, the European Council, actually, the Council of Berlin, it went to a certain degree to organize international relations. It did. Those that were states at that time that had the power actually for them. They divided actually the colonial world, and no fighting, actually recognizing each other's. Well, that didn't work, led to the First World War, and then came the League of Nations. The League of Nations was an improvement. It was a member state. And then that had its limitations, didn't prevent the Second World War. The Second World War came, and then it was a global sort of organization, the UN, based on the sovereignty, on the equality of all sovereign states. Now, we are seeing the limitations of that. Vanuatu is also a sovereign state that has an equal voice, actually, where, you have India, the billion, and China, and the US, and it has the same voice. Maybe a new order where Africa would, as a whole, would be one entity, maybe Latin America one entity. Europe has already gone in that direction, and America, and maybe a new way of a sane way, rational way of reorganizing society globally that will lead to a more realistic and more rational approach to regulating international relations. Hopefully that's where we might move towards, but it's something you wish for. We see elements of it. There is a discussion actually going on. Hopefully, Africa cannot be isolated from the rest of the world. The AU alone cannot function in a world of which it is a part. And therefore, hopefully, there would be a global movement, after this debacle we see now. I just wanted to mention those two. About the regional, everybody is talking about the regional, in other words, Ethiopia, Eritrea, and they have petty, they have interests actually. The Arab Gulf is coming as a new force right now. They're very aware of their situation, that their wealth is based on hydrocarbons. Hydrocarbons are on the, down, and they want to invest now in the rest of the economy globally. They've invested in the West a lot. They've invested in the East, particularly in maritime transport and all that. And now they want to come into Africa. And the entry point for them, they see, is the Red Sea. Is the Red Sea. And the UAE is supporting Ethiopia because, the Red Sea Council, does not include the UAE. The UAE wanted to be a member of the Red Sea Council, but the Egyptian, I mean, the Saudis do not want them actually to come there. They didn't. Well, you were in the Gulf over there, in the Red Sea. They wanted control, so they didn't allow them. Now, what does UAE do? It supports actually the other countries on the African side. It is supporting Ethiopia. That's the only basis. It's supporting Ethiopia so that Ethiopia could have some access also to the Red Sea. It would be an instrument of including it. The same thing with Sudan also. By supporting the RSF, if the RSF was to form a government, then it will have control. It will have access to the Red Sea. And what it wants is control of the ports on the Red Sea side. Well, it is supporting Ethiopia. Eritrea was supporting, Isa supported Hemeti at the beginning. Completely changed because he had a fight with the Emiratis. They wanted to rent the port of Assa. And they rented it a long time ago when they were fighting against the Houthis. They were using it as a base to attack the Houthis. And at that time, they were giving him $50 million. And Isaias wanted $500 million. They wouldn't give him $500 million. There was a fight. And then Isaias shifted actually to supporting the government simply because Ethiopia, also his competitor, is supporting Hemeti. So they have their petty national interests, actually. The Egyptians have a strategic interest in Sudan. Sudan has always been their backyard. Sudan has been the linchpin of their waters of the Nile policy. They wanted actually, and they used Sudan in all their arguments, and that is why many are wary when the regional countries, Egypt, for example, right now is saying, well, the institutions that are supposed to mediate for peace in Sudan are not working. The UN doesn't even recognize that Sudan, represents a threat to international peace. It wouldn't. And therefore, if it doesn't recognize it as a threat to international peace, then it doesn't get involved directly. Secondly, the African Union is not in a position to do so. The Arab League is too weak, too divided to do so. So we should be the ones to mediate. Now, with the failure of all those institutions to come up with a plausible solution for Sudan, you can't tell them, no, you can't, you shouldn't do it. But you can imagine the shortcomings of that also, because I don't know what Ethiopia would do tomorrow, actually, to such a thing. Isaias, of course, is there always trying to find actually entry point actually too. So I think the only hope we have is finally the AU, which has already taken a position that the government had come through a coup and therefore it's illegal, illegitimate, but then it doesn't have the clout actually to then act on behalf of the Sudanese people. It's a dilemma. It's a dilemma. It's a dilemma. That puts a greater burden, therefore, on Sudanese institutions, particularly the civilian organizations in Sudan, including civil society, to come up with a common position against the war in Sudan. That is the beginning, really, and the hope.
Thank you. Don, I think I'm going to ask you to bring us to a close because we are out of time and we recognize that online participants have been with us for quite some time. So on that note, that Ambassador Menkerias is handing over to you the baton of this wicked problem, but he's given us an inkling of the solution. You talked about a new Pan-Africanism. So Don, over to you to close us off, please.
Thank you very much, Shuvai, and also Babatunde and the rest of the colleagues, Professor Eka and so on. I've tried to bunch what I could see into a few major bullet points, answering the various questions. Obviously, I can't answer all of them. And I'd just like to tell Ambassador Menkerias, just in case I may have been misunderstood, that I am certainly not campaigning for some naive African, locking ourselves in our own tent and not engaging anyone kind of approach. No, certainly we are part of the world. We need the world, and also the world needs us. So the two are not mutually exclusive. AU can unite Africa and help the African states, and more importantly, the African peoples in their engagements with the rest of our counterparts globally. And that's what it should do. After all, that is what all the rest of our counterparts are doing with the EU, with the OECD, and other such bodies. The G20, the G whatever, they're all bunching themselves in order to engage with the rest of the world on their terms. And all of our states, even the most largest or richest in our own context, is not strong enough to engage on the biggest issues that we need on its own. On the issue of Pan-Africanism, to make it very clear, I did not limit my Pan-Africanism to the African Union. My Pan-Africanism predates the African Union and extends beyond the African Union. Therefore, I will only use the African Union to the extent that it responds to my issues. And if it doesn't do, I go beyond it. And we've got examples. And I really like that you mentioned it, Ambassador Haile. One of them is a Gen Z in Kenya. We've shown what the power of the people, especially if we rely on our younger people, ideally have very meaningful and respectful intergenerational discourses, how far it can take us. They demanded, and the whole world stopped and had them. I want an African Gen Z round 2 focusing on Africa. And I'd like to just also encourage us that a lot of the ideation that led to the transformation, for instance, from the OAU to the AU, didn't come from the member states. It came from academia, from CODESRIA, the Council for the Development of Social Science Research in Africa, from individuals like Professor Horace Campbell, from the Ghanaian professor of law, Kofi Kumado, and Adama Dieng, our brother, who actually got a team that drafted the Constitutive Act in Salim Salim's office literally for free. So I think we leverage on the strengths that we have to push for the world that we want to see. I support a Bandung 2.0, and I make no apologies about it. And I also tell you, this hope, if you look at what has happened in the tax justice space in the last 10 years, the work that has gone on towards a UN framework convention on tax, you will get hope. Starting with the Mbeki panel report in 2014, illicit financial flows from Africa, and then his engagement of the world with it. And then in their leadership of the UN General Assembly and ECOSOC, Nigeria and Norway working together in 2020, creating what we call the UN FACTI, which was a high-level panel at the UN level equivalent to the Mbeki panel to focus on illicit financial flows and financing for achieving the SDGs. And you see that now we actually have, in 2022, in a short 8 years, despite opposition from principally all of the global north, all the global net states voted to keep taxation issues, which is the greatest domestic resource mobilization issue. They voted to keep it in their club, the OECD. Everybody else voted to keep it in the UN, to take it to the UN, and for us to have a UN-level convention, a UN-level treaty that sets out a UN treaty body. So discussions on what to do about taxation are done at least in the UN. It's been massive movement in 8 years on the most important thing, economics, you know. And yes, many AU processes have been started by the people and not by the leaders. If you look at the Gender is My Agenda campaign, GMAC, which is the most vibrant citizen space at the AU, the entire creation of the African human rights system, the establishment of now what we call the African Court to complement the African Commission was citizen-driven. The anti-corruption agenda leading to, you know, a treaty and a treaty body was citizen-driven. So we need to think beyond how we've been thinking, and let's not get boxed into what is being implemented now by the bureaucrats in Addis and the bureaucrats that come from the member states. The sister that made the point about the complex and intertwined nature of the conflicts we have, of our peace and security situation, of our political economy, that is very, very true. And my response to that is that peace negotiators and other actors, including African citizens in general, need to pay more fidelity to the common African positions that we have on various issues. The one good thing the AU is good at is that it's a good policy factory. On almost every important issue, it has a well-reasoned, well-researched, well-negotiated common African position or another policy document on the economy, on illicit financial flows, on sovereign debt, on corruption, on climate, on agriculture, on the blue economy, on mining oil and gas, on our shared values. So the more that we, the people, articulate these carefully crafted policy standards, which bring out the best in us and insist that they go into negotiations, including peace negotiations, so that we are not reinventing the wheel or settling for second best. I think that can be a value add to where we are. Mesga now mentioned as two good examples of the recent past, RRCs, the Revitalized Agreement for the Resolution of Conflict in South Sudan, and the Pretoria Agreement on Ethiopia between, on the one hand, the government of Abiy Ahmed, and on the other hand, TPLF, TDF. I would go even further when you're talking about best practices to focus on our peak. One of our peaks was resolving the situation in Kenya in 2008. And we did it actually with less instruments than we have now. We did with the Constitutive Act, the Peace and Security Protocol, and one or two others. Follow-up instruments like the African Charter on Democracy, Elections, and Governance had not even come into force. But the difference that we had then versus now was leadership, especially leadership at the apex, at the level of heads of state, and at the level of the leadership of key institutions, such as the African Union Commission and others. That's the difference between then and now, and that is something we can call for. In Kenya in 2008, the leadership came from the top. John Kufuor, the then chair of the AU Assembly of Heads of State and Government, personally intervened and flew to Nairobi, took charge. Appointments of the high-level panel was done by the chair of the assembly, Kofi Annan, Ben Mkapa, and Graça Machel Mandela. Reporting was to the chair of the assembly. And then with that, the chair of the assembly and other members of the assembly could leverage, Assembly of Heads of State, could leverage all the strategic assets, the carrots and sticks, in order to force these people within some reasonable time, promptly, to come to a deal we could live with, carrots and sticks. When necessary, in addition to this, John Kufuor spoke with Kikwete, the then president of Tanzania, and Kikwete flew to Nairobi. Look at the difference now. On both the Ethiopia problem that we had, starting 2020, and the Sudan one, appointments are at the level of the chair of the AU Commission, of the Secretariat, not at the level of the chair of the Assembly of Heads of State. Reporting goes to the AUC Commission chair, not to the chair of the Heads of State. The last three chairs of the Assembly of Heads of State have not made any meaningful statement on the major crisis the continent has faced in this period, on COVID, on Ethiopia, on Sudan, which is the world's worst humanitarian disaster at the moment, incomparable. And we did that properly. Indeed, at the level of the ambassadors, they started by promptly convening the day after the guns began on Saturday, 15th April. They actually convened on a Sunday. But where was the follow-up? There were so many cooks, each doing this, each doing that. This AU ad hoc mechanism impacted this other one, eventually took over a year to have a three-person high-level panel, which was the best practice we had already developed 15 years ago in the Kenyan conflict. So these are the things we must demand. The legal instruments, the Constitutive Act, the Peace and Security Protocol, the other policy instruments give the individuals that we have in office all the power to do everything they need to do, like they did for Kenya. They are not just using it. And indeed, I agree with the sister that said, it's Asma that said, that powerful diplomatic actors like Nigeria, like South Africa, like others can still play a very important role in motivating effective action from the top. In that whole negotiation period between the north and the south of Sudan and so on, at crucial points, the Nigerian government jumped in. There are periods, I don't know the history correct, there are periods when they flew all the leaders of the various protagonists into Nigeria, into Abuja, to have a conversation with them to push for action. So we can get there. The army and the security sector in Africa generally, this needs a whole conversation of us as citizens. And again, as I said, we can use the AU and so on to pass the policy factory, but it can be driven by academia, by civil society demanding no more, that we must have a regulatory regime that transforms our security sector from being regime enforcers rooted in our colonial history to actually serve the people and allow themselves and force civilian oversight, elected democratic civilian oversight of our security sector. Right now in Kenya, we're dealing with a rogue Kenya that has become a ground for abducting political actors and human rights activists and illegally getting them transported across borders into South Sudan, into Uganda, into torture, into arbitrary arrest, into sham charges, and even into being killed. So part of what we're doing as Kenyan activists is mounting a very strong fight within the Kenyan system, and again, in Uganda, in Tanzania, in South Sudan at the moment, and to expand, that we must force a reform of our security sector and civilian oversight of our security sector across the continent, because this is a shared problem across the continent. This model of creating a regular army and then creating a paramilitary direct, protection force for yourself that Bashir did with the RSF is exactly what Museveni is doing with the Presidential Guard Brigade. And these paramilitaries are the ones that did the coups that we're seeing in the Sahel, So it's a continent-wide problem. And part of the ways we can even help our Sudanese colleagues is ensure there are continent-wide conversations that include them and include these issues so that the heat is taken off them to try and solve all the complex issues that they're forced to solve. And finally, follow the money. As you said, what's the role of the military, as Asma said, and all of you actually, in looting, recorded and unrecorded in Sudan? What's been the role of the military and putting the military in the economy in Egypt over the last 60, 70 years, in lots of other countries, even a country like Zimbabwe? What's been the role of the military from Mugabe times? And so on. So, and other actors, other members of the elite, political elite and the economic elite, the cabals that surround our political leaders. So we really need to use our investigative journalists to follow the money, to identify who has what, got it from where, has kept it where, what's the role of Dubai in a lot of the conflicts that we have, not just RSF, but others. So I think partnerships between academia, between civil society, between investigative journalists, would be able to unearth a lot in a way that will be able to mobilize enough of an agency, enough of a movement for change. Because left to the heads of state that we have right now, most of whom are intellectual and moral midgets, we're not going to get far. But unless we want to change them overnight, or the institutions overnight, we have to work partly with what exists, even as we think of fundamental reform to make them fit for purpose. Sorry, I rambled on for so long, but let me stop there.
Thank you so much. I'm going to hand back to Tunde to close us off. Thank you.
Right. Thank you very much, everyone. Unfortunately, we have come to the end, and I actually have spent at least 45 more minutes beyond the time that we were meant to close, and still we're unable to deal with some of the issues. We said we would be looking into the Horn. Much of the conversation focused on Sudan, understandably so, because of the realities, of the day. We didn't touch much on GERD, the dynamics between the countries involved, Egypt, Sudan, and Ethiopia around the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. We couldn't do much about Ethiopia versus Somalia as it relates to Somaliland, which is also a burning issue that needs to be looked into. We couldn't also talk about Eritrea and Ethiopia, which I'm sure we could have benefited from Haile's experience and knowledge. The internal problems in Ethiopia also, which actually threaten not just the Ethiopian state, but its contiguous neighbors, we couldn't really look into. But nonetheless, I think it's been a very, engaging day or evening, and I would like to, on behalf of the organizers, congratulate the panelists. If we could kindly just give them. On the lighter note, one of the lessons of the day is when you give diplomats and lawyers the floor, it becomes, quite engaging, even more than you envisaged. But really very salient comments, feedback, and of course, to thank colleagues who are online, our friends. It's impossible to see you all, but really we would like to thank you for the resilience you've stayed on for so long and contributed massively. So thank you so very much. On the final notes, on behalf of the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue, allow me to convey our utmost gratitude to our eternal friends at the ALC at King's College. Shuvai, it's been a pleasure doing this with you. I hope that we'll be seeing more of each other in Nairobi rather than in the capitals, in different places, which usually is the case. Again, thank you very much. Enjoy your evening.